After those 4 excellent papers this morning that are both very interesting for the detail they presented and very thought-provoking for some of the issues that were raised, and I think quite inspiring for the potential that they highlight as well. We'll now move to a panel discussion session where 3 archaeologists eminent archaeologists have kindly agreed to provide their comments and thoughts on the papers we've heard. It's, as I said earlier, this has been a really, really valuable part of this series of seminars before. It's interesting to get those comments. These are papers that obviously the panel members haven't seen them before. So it is very much their perspectives as scholars on the issues they think they raise, and they have been very much welcome to say whatever they want. The first of our panelists today, his name has already been mentioned, of course, and so we're absolutely delighted we've got Miklos Takas to give his thoughts. Thank you very much, Miklos. I think you might be muted. There we are.
Do you hear me now? Sorry, these are all technical problems. Thank you for inviting me. Nice greetings to everybody who is here. Well, much of things had been said, and my personal achievement was a bit too exaggerated by Tibor, and I can tell him thank you for this, but I try to get not a so personal view. By my point of view, there are if we want to summarize all these issues, we can say that we can see we have to focus on the fact that we have seen many diversities, but as it is being said, many similar things, and these are very, very important. When we are working on these rescue excavations, we are always feeling ourselves a bit isolated because we are doing our job and everybody is literally set against us, all the investors, all the builders. But now we can see that we are also members of a family, and that is very important to say for everybody is doing this, that we are not isolated. That's the first thing that had to be said. The second thing is that we are in a position that the vast majority of new information concerning the archaeology and especially concerning the medieval rural archaeology is to be provided on these rescue excavations. So it is a science per exemplar. And this is very important to see that the main problem is not how to excavate this, because we are managing it, but how to process it, how to make let's say a science of it, how to make an evaluation. And the problems are also similar here because the ESTO does not want to pay for this, and the lack of finances is very big, especially concerning the medieval rural archaeology, where a lot of very many information had to be gathered prior to have a complete view. But it would be very helpful if we have such overviews like this seminar today, and I have a strong hope that this is going to be published like a paper, and then we can show it. Then we will have an argument to say, well, this is not a money that was given to nothing, but this has its purpose, and this is a primary task of not only monument protection, but also to affirm the archaeology as a historical science. So thank you for this wonderful seminar, and greetings to everybody, especially greetings to the cat of Tibor, who was also participating. Sorry for this last joke, but I had to make it. So I think I'm now in 2 minutes. So thank you very much for having my little conversation. I hope you have heard me.
Yes, sorry, I was just switching my own microphone back on. I think I switched it off there. Thank you very much for those thoughts, Miklos, and we may well come back to you with some questions on that, I think, a little bit later, as someone who has had a huge impact on this whole area over a sustained period of time. So I'm now going to hand over to the second panel member, Tomasz Klier. Sorry, I should have introduced Miklas earlier as from the Academy of Science in Budapest. Tomasz is at Charles University in Prague. And of course, the Czech Republic was featured on an earlier one of these seminars. But Tomasz is now speaking from obviously outside the area. It's been the states that have been addressed in detail this morning, but from the same broad Central Eastern European, Central European area. So Tomasz, thank you very much.
Many thanks. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, and many thanks to all speakers today. Only some remarks short, maybe banalities. So it was possibility to make an overview and summary of this infrastructure archaeology in Central Europe. And firstly, I would like to mention that we have heard about differences between Austria, Poland, Bulgaria, and Hungary. But there are very important internal differences in infrastructure archaeology. We have seen it in the case of Austria. So I think it's very important that these lands are not homogeneous. The second point I would like to stress is that our knowledge is not representative. Firstly, actually, we have heard about great scale, macro scale, great scale infrastructure rescue archaeological excavations. So we know much about early medieval settlements and so on. But actually, there has been only a little about micro scale archaeological research, and of course, it is connected with cross-disciplinary research. I think Pavel Vařeka spoke about these approaches, so archaeological excavation in still living villages. So, and actually, it was only maybe in Austria, Claudia spoke about this microscale archaeology. So I think so. It is my impression that this cross-disciplinary research has been missing here today, and I am very happy that, and I enjoy it, that we have heard about scientific questions, like in the case of Hungary. So it's important because I think that our knowledge can rise only based on systematic scientific questions and research. So I'm sorry if I'm boring. So the next point, what maybe it's missing here, it's the question of prediction of building activities and the scope of this infrastructure destruction in the next decades or years. I remember it's about 40 years ago. It was period of great expansion of cities in Czechoslovakia, and now I remember the case of Prague. Many suburbs developed, etc. And the archaeologists formulated systematic research of hinterlands of the city of Prague, and they made prediction. So it is the state today, and in the next 20, 40 years, the state of building activities would be so, etc. So I think that prediction is extremely important. And maybe the last point, actually, today we are speaking about infrastructure archaeology, but my impression is that in the last years or decade or the last decade, we lost the hugest information potential in the harvested regions, so in woodlands. After this, it is connected with climate change, with harvesting, with bark beetle, calamite disaster, and so. And I think that we now we have a lot of information, and it is multiplication of information due to this infrastructure rescue archaeology. But actually, I think that the greatest problem in Central Europe, in hilly areas, is this destruction of relics of medieval settlements and field relics in woodlands. So many thanks to all speakers. It was very nice to do this overview.
Thank you very much for that, Tomasz. And again, thought-provoking comments about the problems that still remain, and your comments about woodland are a really interesting one. And I think we'll pick that up in a moment. Is what are our blind spots still, and the issue of environmental change, I think, is something that well, Claudia mentioned that particularly. You know, the legislative structure around development of large infrastructure seems mostly in place, even if it's not perfectly followed through, but is there much more that's kind of evading our attention and that is being lost without us being aware of it, that we need to think about. So thank you very much for that. And I'm now going to ask Neil Christie to be the final panel member and to give his thoughts. Neil is at the University of Leicester. He's a committee member for the Medieval Settlement Research Group, but he's also carried out research and published syntheses across Europe as well. So I was really pleased that he was able to come in, although being based in England seems a long way from the area we are discussing today. Primarily, the seminar series as a whole has ranged across Europe from Ireland to Bulgaria, I think is its east-west greatest extent. From Denmark down to Italy. And so having that wider perspective as a final panel member, I think I was absolutely delighted Neil was able to come in on that. And so Neil, I'll hand over to you. And I think then we'll open it up for some sort of questions and discussion as well. A sort of conversation between panel members, I think would be nice to spend a little bit of time on that while we have the opportunity and we've got everyone in the room. So Neil.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, I have dabbled a bit in Austrian and Hungarian archaeology, looking mainly at sort of early medieval landscapes and peoples, etc. And I was very struck at the start. You know, I do Roman archaeology as well, and often Roman archaeologists don't bother going to Northern and Central Europe and Eastern Europe, etc. And there's some amazing archaeology, and I think everyone saw some of the fruits of that today. I must admit, though, for medieval archaeology, I think we're ahead of the game in some ways, and I ought to recommend all the Ruralia stuff, all the publications and conferences there, which really do talk to a sort of pan-European audience and you know, do help share. I'm going to sort of repeat a few things that Miklos and Tomasz have said in terms of sharing of information, dissemination, etc. And I think in particular, Tibor and Edith identified the way that there's a huge amount of material that's being generated by these infrastructure projects, fascinating data, but what we do with it at the end is so important. And it was interesting to hear about how some museums are required to link in. Some of the bigger projects have temporary exhibitions, etc. And that's really good, but it's only part of the process of sharing all this information. So merely having these seminars is really good in terms of providing a shared forum and possibility for overviews. So my compliments to all the speakers are excellent, really informative, very revealing in terms of the archaeology. And what I liked was both the positives and negatives. It's quite easy to focus just on the positives of how much more data come out, but there's always an issue of coping with that material, especially when you hear 90% of archaeological work in Hungary is now infrastructure led. At the same time, although we've been focusing on medieval, it was really nice to hear for the Bulgarian side of Gramada, the way that the landscape is a long history of activity, and seeing sort of everything from Neolithic all the way through to the 15th century was fascinating. So a few little points to mention. I was going to I quite like the way that for Poland, Pavel identified the way that even the infrastructure work can find bits of medieval infrastructure in terms of the roadways, the trackways, the wells and mills as well. And too often we dwell a bit too much on the houses, and to understand how the houses fit into the landscape is really good. It was quite scary in many ways to hear that so few sort of embracing projects that are generated by all this infrastructure work. So to hear for Hungary, the Otska project, where it's trying to bring together different expertise, but then to hear how it's finite, only sort of spanned up those 3 years. And I know in Ireland, there's been much more work in terms of sort of trying to make the infrastructure work come together into an organic and academic whole. It was interesting that the way that different periods can be focused on. So in Poland, the way that the early medieval has stood out far more from the work, and that there are gaps in terms of the late medieval. And that's where Carenza's work on sort of continuously occupied villages and how you can approach those is good. So the two other little things I mentioned, apart from apart from publications and the need the way we have to share it, is first of all, it was really nice to hear from Claudia, and also from Edith and Tibor, about the impact of climate change, how we need to be far more aware of damage to the landscape that's occurring, which is either going to mask the archaeology, so the flood prevention work in Hungary and the snow lakes in the Austrian Alps is really important to hear about, and we've got to some sort of strategy for that. The final thing I was going to mention was in terms of the gaps, and Thomas sort of partly hinted at this as well. In many ways, often the pipelines and the motorways go through fairly flat land, the open land, etc. It does avoid some of the houses, living houses, but it avoids things like slopes sites, hilltop venues, etc., which is where a lot of archaeology is hidden away, especially for the early medieval period in particular. And we know that riverside locations are the ones that have been lost almost generally, and they were the favoured areas for early medieval settlement. So we're going to be aware of the gaps, and I think the work on woodlands is really important there. But overall, I've learned hugely from all the papers, and my eyes have been fully open to the vast potential, but the vast gaps also that still remain in terms of what we do with all this material. So apologies for going on for 3 minutes and a half there.
That's all right. That's fine. I was sort of I said 2 minutes, partly to avoid being too intimidating, because it is difficult to summarise papers you haven't heard on the hoof. But actually, I think that's often when the kind of the most powerful insights come out, because they are the ones you had to kind of think, what has really hit me about what we've heard. So I don't know if anyone wants to, either Miklos or Thomas, want to come back at all with any additional comments. If you would like to come back in, Miklos, you were very, very brief, so yes, you've got your hand up. I thought you might want to add a little, so feel free to come back in, please.
I try to stick in 2 minutes, but if I would have a third minute, I would speak about the chances, how to process this huge material. And I think that we were not speaking about it, but it is very important to say that the younger generation has also part in it. And all who are teaching on universities, we have to encourage every student who wants to do his BA, MA, or PhD work in this subject, that he is kindly asked to do so. So where I'm teaching on the university, I'm always offering this. But as you know, we archaeologists are a lot of times we also try to process nice things in terms that they are jewelry or something like that, and ceramics doesn't belong to this kind of material. But it is also our task to say that everybody who is interested in it, and not only those people who were literally excavating this, but everybody else is also kindly asked to be part of this work. And that would be the third minute.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point, because one of the issues we've been looking at from within the Medieval Settlement Research Group is the pipeline into medieval settlement studies, and we're primarily based in the UK, so we've been particularly thinking about that. But medieval rural settlements are not a subject that are widely studied in UK universities, and I don't think UK universities are alone in that. And I wonder, listening to all of these 4 seminars that we've had, and with this morning's most fresh in my mind, and some of what we've seen this morning, whether, given that we want to publish this seminar series anyway, perhaps we could use that as an opportunity to be a shop front, if you like, a showcase for how exciting and important the subject is. And I think if we can aim to publish these seminar papers, and I think I would also like, and I'm thinking slightly, on the foot now, I think it would be useful in the publication actually also to have commentary from the panel members, because those insights have been so interesting and so useful. But I think if we could aim for something that an undergraduate student could look at this resource and think, this is an amazing subject. There's a huge amount we don't know that can be discovered. There's a huge amount of moral value in being part of that process of discovery, because sites are turning up unexpectedly and are then either not being, they may be excavated, but they're not being made available properly. Maybe the developers aren't very interested in the medieval sites because they don't provide quite the richness of finds, perhaps, of some of the earlier sites. So perhaps a publication of our seminar series is an opportunity for us to make the case to students who will then think, right, I've done my undergraduate degree, I've seen how interesting this material is, this is what I want to specialise in when I go into working, doing my PhD or go into professional practice. So thank you very much for that added insight, Miklas. Neil, you've got your hand up to come back in on that.
Yeah, just linked into publication. What was really nice was many of the speakers identified publications that have come out of the infrastructure work. Some of them small, some synthetic, etc. And I'm reviews editor for both MSRG, but also for medieval archaeology. And one thing I feel there's a gap in terms of getting those non-UK, non-sort of Western European volumes advertised sufficiently. So I think our journals have got a fantastic way of maybe advertising some of the work that's been published. So if you can encourage your own national publishers to send on medieval stuff to us, we can at least advertise it through a book review at least, or find ways within a newsletter to advertise some of the work that has been published.
Yes, and I think several of you mentioned the presence of English abstracts or English summaries in them, and that is, and some of your publications clearly are in English as well, and that lingua franca, that common language that English offers, and it's perhaps easy for me to say that English is my first language and I'm very lucky in that, but what English does do, and I speak French, a little bit German, but English does at least offer that language that we can all communicate, or more of us can communicate across. And I'm also thinking whether, when perhaps as part of the process of bringing this seminar series to publication, we should also think about an online resource. I think it would be really good perhaps have some GIS linked resource across Europe where actually you could see where are the sites where there's an abstract in English that you can click on that abstract, even if it's just a few hundred words or a couple of thousand words, to have sites across the continent where you can actually find abstracts and maybe a couple of photographs. It sounds like a huge project, but perhaps if we started, we could see if we could set up something that would grow. Maybe we'd be able to get some funding to do that. Either from one of the European organisations, from one of the research funders, because it does. I've been really struck. Neil mentioned my work looking in inhabited settlements, and that's extended across the Netherlands, Czech Republic, Poland, and from last year, a little work in Germany as well. And Poland, for instance, I was very struck by the difficulties of dating the pottery sufficiently closely. So we got sort of pottery sequences that going from sort of 1100 to 1800. That makes it very difficult to sort of discriminate out what's going on. And I suspect there's obviously work being done. It's interesting to hear about the work being done in Hungary on this. And as Tomasz made the point, these are not homogeneous places, and the pattern in one place is not going to be the same as the other, but some of the same problems occur. And if we can just be more aware of what information is out there through something where it's accessible to get these summaries, then perhaps we can start doing more work on this into the future. I'm going to draw Gareth in now to who is chairing the sort of Q&As to speakers. So thank you very much, Miklos, Tomasz and Neil, for those comments. Obviously, you stay on the line. There will be questions that may be aimed at you, but this is mainly to think about questions for the earlier speakers as well. So Gareth, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I think given the amount that we've sort of covered and spoken about, I'll try and just sort of group these conversations. I put questions and I put them in the chat as well. So I think if broadly they're sort of linking on that issue of sort of blind spots and bias of certain types of site, and then also the kind of the publication sort of data management issues as well. So I think if it's okay, we'll just go around the speakers in turn. And I think if we first look at this, I've written it in the chat, but I'll just sort of say it again. It's sort of grouped from a number of observations. So an important point you highlighted in your papers is the tendency for these infrastructure sites to perhaps identify certain types of site more frequently. So what are the key blind spots in your area? So if I maybe go to Claudia first. Are you there, Claudia?
So, what question do you mean, that from Judith or the other one?
I think in relation to your country and and your paper.
Yeah, yes, but what question? I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, it's the first question. What are the key blind spots that you're not sort of seeing?
Have you actually got the question visible there, Claudia? Perhaps if you could read it out, Gareth.
Yes, I can read it out. The blind spots. What are the blind spots? The blind spot is what I also have written in the chat, and we only have parts of the rural settlements when we excavate them during the infrastructure project. And that was my question, because we only have parts because the excavation do not go beyond the boundaries of the project itself, and we only see parts and we do not see the whole settlement, and that is a pity for us, and for me that it's a key blind spot.
Yes, I saw that in the chat that you'd sort of you'd put about that, and I think in England, for example, like we absolutely will not sort of extend beyond the impact area. I think the only instance is maybe if there's half a burial or something like that, you sort of maybe
yes.
Make it so no, that'd be interesting.
But I thought seeing the maps from Tibor and Pavel, I thought they may go beyond these boundaries, and that was my question.
Okay, well, we sort of bring that in then in the subsequent sort of speakers. So I wonder if Pavel, you might want to sort of respond to that. Are your excavations sort of going beyond the area of direct impact? And what are your blind spots as well?
So could you repeat the question?
Are your excavations only are they restricted to exactly the areas that are being destroyed?
Yes,
or
yes.
Are you going beyond?
Also, the problem that was, I think that this problem was pointed in few publication and that I was read recently. And even if the border of the infestation or the round cut in the half of the grave, it was not possible to dig all grave, you know. And the administration strictly accorded to this rule that archaeologists couldn't, you know, even with the settlement, we know that the features are cut in the half. It wasn't possible to excavate all of them, and you know it was the main problem of organization of excavation, and you know the no one pays for it. So.
And you, I mean, obviously your paper fascinating in terms of these unexpected early medieval sites, and then you sort of introduced some of the later.
It was amazing because we collected data about the sites, and the infrastructure archaeology or rescue archaeology shows that, you know, our predicting boundaries of the sites are completely different. So probably all the data that we collected and we built our knowledge about the settlement patterns are wrong.
It's very interesting. I had a thought with Zbradko and Bulgaria there. If you wanted to have some thoughts there, because you introduced using geophysics and targeting some of the sites as well. How regularly are you using that sort of approach, and have you got sort of types of sites you're not seeing as well?
Yes, thank you, Gareth, for the question, for all the discussion, because it's the most important, I think, in infrastructure projects, in these pipelines and highways. We have very good results. They are real cross sections of all the agricultural lands in Bulgaria and all countries in Europe. But what we are doing after that, of course, when we found the main points of the archaeology, Roman or medieval, doesn't matter. Yes, we have, like in Poland and in Austria, the same main problem with the companies, with road agency, with pipeline companies. They don't want to permit just a meter outside of the servitude of the lines to be financed for the excavations or geophysical surveys. Sometimes we use other own sources from the institute, like in example in Gramada. You can imagine that the Roman villa is a whole complex around the pipeline trace, so we have much more buildings in the field around. So we could make real photos and geophysical surveys around, but we don't finance. It's not from the infrastructure projects to point the other places of the Roman buildings from the complex. Also there in Granada, we have a very good opportunity to continue, but maybe win the financing from the municipality, because you could see that we have a part of the settlement from the first period, from the 9th century, but not necropolis. From the second period, we have necropolis, but we couldn't cut the settlement. So they're somewhere around in this same field. So we now try to organize the future excavations in the same area with the agricultural companies that are owners now in the lands, and when they are not in their activity, maybe in the late autumn, maybe we can excavate other part of necropolis and after that bury the field. But it's the main point in that it's not with the financing from these companies, and they use finances from European Union, the millions, and they want to give just a few little finances to finish the excavation. Also, we have a problem to preserve the part with the finances from these infrastructure companies, like Roman Villa is a building. Sometimes we need to replace them. In the case of Gramada, we just succeed to bury the building, not to be destroyed. So the pipeline go under like a tunnel under the building. So we have a problem, like everywhere.
That's very, very interesting. Thank you. I was just gonna move on with the same sort of question for the Hungarian paper then as well. I mean, Ethan, Tibor, you talked about everything being excavated at the start. Is that the case, or are we still the case where actually it's where it's the direct impact and things to the side are sort of not looked at?
Well, according to law, we have to excavate everything at the moment. There are also possibilities to go beyond the lines, so we do not always confine ourselves to the territory of the investment, but this is only possible if there is some money and energy left in the museum. So these projects are financed by the investors. They do not finance going beyond their lines. On my last slide, you could see some volunteers working on our excavations, and this is a key element, a new element in our archaeological processing of finds also and excavations also, because they are present and they are curious, and most of the time, and the majority of these people are using metal detectors. So they come to the place where the excavation is taking place, and they help us with the digging, but they also make field walks around the site. And many times it happened that metal finds were brought into the excavation, which belonged to the same site, and we had no other possibilities at the moment to make the excavation, but later we returned and make the excavation of several features which lay there in the ground. So that to answer Claudia's question. And about blind spots, the thing is that dealing with processing the material is so low percentage in Hungary that in fact we still cannot see the real blind spots, because as we said, we have to excavate everything, and we make sure that data will be available for future generations. And it's very hard to figure out how to move further on from these points. At the moment, we can strive to complete the excavation and hope for the best that somebody who comes in a later generation can move further on and just make the results of these excavations and say whether we made a good job or a bad job.
Yeah. I think
the thing is that many of the panelists mentioned perspective of research and the students, and also Miklós in the situation in Hungary. The thing is that BA and MA students can deal with only smaller materials, because large excavations, in fact, demand making it in a PhD, and it's not a fashionable topic nowadays to deal with manual settlements, or students who are dealing with this topic regularly confine themselves to smaller materials, assemblages of data. So it's very hard to say how can we move further on from this point.
Thank you. That's really interesting answers to that, and I think from an English perspective as well, this sort of notion of sort of blind spots and always being to the side of a site is really interesting, because I think are we talking about sort of finite resources that we can deploy onto sites ultimately? Should we be looking at targeting these sort of finite resources in a way where we're going to maximize sort of research outcomes, questions? I think that's a really interesting conversation. I'm really conscious of time, Carenza. There was a second question about sort of the amount of stuff that's coming up and publication and data management, but I wonder whether maybe because you touched on that in the initial sort of summing up, whether that might be something that some of the other panelists sort of touch on at the end.
Well, I think there's one question, isn't there, that's still there. I think time, as long as we finish on time, the final panelist thought, and we've moved in, I think, to this stage in a way. I wanted to think about, get everyone's thoughts really, these sort of key questions really, which are how can we best capture and use discoveries from infrastructure archaeology to advance knowledge and understanding of rural settlements? How as well can international perspectives contribute? How are we better off looking across different states rather than just in our own areas? And I think as well, I'd be really interested, again, while we have everyone in the room, what should be our priorities to do or to change? And specifically, what can the Medieval Settlement Research Group do to help? What can we try and make happen? And we've talked about that a little bit, thinking about making information more available, you know, English translation so that everybody can access that common information, perhaps something that's certainly available online, perhaps geographically very accessible. And so I think it'd be quite interesting to try and pick that up. There's that one final question, I think, Gareth, do you want to pick that up from Judith about is there any opportunity to, what advice is there for future entrants with an ambition to study rural settlements? And I think that's particularly, that question I think came in before the comment about medieval settlement studies, Thibault's comment about medieval settlement studies being unfashionable. Did you want to throw that to anyone, Gareth?
Yeah, would any of the panel like to sort of or the speakers like to sort of address that question?
Yeah.
Oh, Claudia, sorry.
Yes, may I make a start? And first of all, I really would support and underline what Thibault said, that these huge excavation can't be done in a bachelor or master degree thesis. That is not possible, and you have to have experience in medieval stuff to do these analysis. And I think the students are at the moment more interested in urban archaeology. And as I do it in Vienna, please excuse what I say now, I do many archaeology in 20th century. They are very, very interested in 20th century archaeology. And when they ask me for material for a master or a PhD, most of them ask for modern times. And the students are not so interested in medieval. Well, they are, but more in urban. And what is the case? I would wish they would look more internationally. So they look only in Austria and they do not see our neighbors in Poland and the Czech Republics and Hungary, or even in England or so far. So that is also a bit a problem with the students, and we try to encourage them to go with Erasmus or something like that abroad. But many of them just want to stay in Lower Austria or in the Styria or so on.
It's really interesting, that kind of you know, an international sort of Europe and a European perspective on things as well. That's a good advice for any sort of future students. So Neil, did you have your hand up as well?
Yeah, I did briefly. You know, within the UK, there's the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which does provide some funding for PhD programs. So across the UK, you have different universities that team up and they have PhD competitions. And within that, there's a certain number that are allowed to be outside of the UK, international, US, all the way across Europe, etc. So we have had students at Leicester, for example, who have taken medieval themes, maybe in history rather than archaeology. But you know, there is potential to encourage students, potential PhD students, to look to themes. And again, maybe the MSRG could be a sort of vehicle for that as well. We could sort of pull together. So Yeah, you could do archaeology, you could do something looking at ceramics if you wanted, social economic things, etc., etc. So it's not just archaeology, there are lots of things which could be brought together. So I'm more than happy to chat to anyone about the Leicester link up with the AHRC if people want. And I know Carenza knows much about it for also for her university.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wonder if one of the things that MSRG could do through the mechanism of this seminar and the results of that is actually start to tee up, sort of identify slightly more clearly what are the big questions, or what are the big questions that actually research could start to tackle, so that those sound exciting. I mean, I think Claudia's point that students these days tend to be interested in urban archaeology and 20th century archaeology, and I think we get a tendency towards that as well. But I think perhaps it's just that we're not really sharing the potential interest and excitement of rural settlement studies. The idea that you can discover entire new settlements that have been completely unknown is actually a really exciting one, that you could advance understanding of where those places might appear and create a toolkit or a predictive modelling framework to identify where those lost small settlements might be. Again, a really exciting thing to be able to be done. The challenge of developing a way of interpreting the significance of finds that are not as attention grabbing as a Bronze Age site or a Roman site, a classical period site, or perhaps an urban site with a really rich refuse deposit, for example. But the kind of challenge of more forensically teasing out understanding from more diffuse finds. I think also we haven't really talked about it, but I think it would be interesting to think as well about remote sensing and what opportunities there are within that. When we think about LiDAR, we've obviously talked about woodland areas and forested areas. LiDAR has had a huge potential for doing that. In the UK, certainly much of our LiDAR surveys tended to focus on flood vulnerable areas as a first priority because it's not being done primarily for archaeological purposes. But it is starting to extend beyond that and is telling us something about archaeology in areas that are not visible at the moment. Again, research that focused on using those sorts of technologies, or in remote infrared sensing, for example, which has been used in drier areas. You know, could we be in a position where in 10 years' time we actually have a whole suite of different techniques where we can identify where some of these unexpected, unanticipated medieval rural settlements are, so that it becomes visible? At the moment, perhaps it looks too much like there's nothing there to be found. We don't know where it is. All of what we might find is underneath the existing settlements anyway. Therefore, it's kind of all a bit hopeless. But actually it's not, because what's coming out of these seminars that we've had is this sense that there's stuff out there, and there's actually perhaps a whole body of information at different sorts of levels. Settlements of the later medieval period, settlement of earlier periods underneath our inhabited places. There's a whole and all these remote areas, mountain areas, forest areas, perhaps areas that are riverside areas. You know, there's a lot there that we could you know, we need to make it more exciting and make it easier for students who, after all, are not experts and haven't spent decades of their lives studying this, to immediately get a feeling of, wow, I could do something here that would be interesting and make a difference. So I think there's potential. Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
May I drop in?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yes, I think that is a very good idea, Carenza, and maybe I can add a point. I think we need for the students, and that they write their master and PhD thesis, we need for the students special research questions. I think it wouldn't be good to say, here you have the stuff from a rural settlement somewhere. Please do an analysis, interpret it, and so on. I think then they get lost. When they get lost in the data, massive data. But if we have special questions, what about the economy? What about the structure of the villages? What about the populations? And what about the markets? Then maybe you get only answers to few questions, but you get more profound answers.
And perhaps the fact that, you know, there is an issue about looking across boundaries, across borders in areas that were previously part of the same polities or have sometimes been part of the same polities, perhaps the challenge of doing studies across borders. And you have such an advantage in continental Europe, and in the UK and Ireland, we're sort of, it seemed very stuck off the edge, really. But, you know, you still got the questions, the fact that, you know, in much of the medieval period, England and France, much of France were part of the same polity. You've got the same trends and patterns. The challenge of transnational studies, I think, is something that's really interesting to encourage that. It's an exciting idea to compare work in, you know, Poland and Germany, for example, and see what opportunities that throws up of different questions coming to the fore. The final point as well, I thought another point, is the role of communities and members of the public, wider publics, I think, and the suggestion that this is how do we get people interested in this. The question of the medieval period, we have quite an issue in some states, and certainly England is one of them, or the UK is one of them. You know, the medieval period can be quite toxified, and that also is the situation in some European states. It's quite a lot of nationalistic, quite difficult nationalistic and ethnic issues around sort of these different ethnic identities. But actually, members of the public are interested in places where they live, places they know, places they have a sense of connection with and identity with. And again, for students thinking about a subject to study, the fact that again, perhaps make it more clear to students that, you know, if they're studying rural settlements, these are topics that are going to be of interest. The people who are living in these areas, experience them, have questions about them, perhaps ideas about them. I was very struck, one tiny detail on one of Powell's slides was where you had the two sites that had turned up, early medieval remains. I think it was site 16 and site 18 on your slide, and I can't remember the name of the settlement. Without going back over my notes, but the road was actually kinking around those two distributions there, and that threw up to me. I don't know if that road's recent and has been put around that recently, or whether that road was kinking before, and in which case, how old is the road? And, you know, again, that's quite an interesting sort of subject that anybody living in that area might suddenly think, oh goodness, I never really thought about that. But equally, it's something that students can sort of delve into as well. So I think drawing in members of the public, and the comment was made in the context of the work in Hungary as well. Thibault, I know you've got that work going on in Hungary, and I was very struck in Budapest recently, you know, seeing that work in drawing in members of the public who were initially interested from a metal detecting perspective, which can be problematic, but drawing them into working within a sort of research framework about here's a settlement, you can contribute a wider understanding through the metal detecting, but how does that actually help us understand? It's giving people a role and a value, which again is an exciting thing to be able to do. For us as well as for students. Miklos.
I'm very happy for raising the issue of PhD students, because I see that this is a point that is for everybody interesting. And I want to point out that Claudia has right, that we have to formulate proper questions. And as I am teaching rural archaeology on the second year of studies on Pazman University, I can observe that every second year there is one student who wants to deal with this, and this is the fact that everything is more fancy and more interesting. But we can have a help from other parts. We are also having a very intense course on non-invasive archaeology. And very many students who are doing this are also interested in doing rural settlements and structure of rural settlements. But they always say, well, if I have some ceramics, you professor, you are well knowing this issue, so you are going to say what this ceramics is where this has to be dated. And then so I am doing the problem of the datation, and then the problem is solved, because the real problem is that the students are running from the ceramics. That's the point that they don't like, and I see it, and I'm not happy because I was half of my career I was processing ceramics, but that is the fact. So I cannot do anything with this because this is the fact. And yes, we as teachers have to make the life as easy for the students. But we are, let's say, we are coaches, and the game is played by them, and we are standing on the playground and saying them, yelling them that shoot a goal, etc., etc. But the job has to be done by them, and that is not easy. And the first issue is when we are standing on a site and we are seeing that it is going to be taken by machines, then we are not thinking on anybody else, but that we have to rescue it. And then if we cannot do it, the next generation will, with good help of the good God, do it. And then we have to be optimistic that the next generation will perhaps have more interest in these issues.
And the challenge to us is to communicate that,
Yes,
I guess,
right.
whether it's to our students individually or whether it's more widely in terms of sharing the outcomes and the challenges, the puzzles. You know, members of the public are very interested. You give them a question, something we don't know the answers, and they get engaged. You can draw people in, and that, you know, sharing that information, communicating, I think is something that's important for us. So thank you very, very much. We're at 1 o'clock UK time now, which is our sort of time to finish. I suspect we could go on having this conversation probably all afternoon. And that has been the case with all of these seminars. It feels that sense that coming together, talking about this, there is so much that's been achieved. There's so much that's sitting there. It feels almost like an unexploded bomb in some respects. We've got so much knowledge and information that has the potential to make such a difference. But at the moment, it's slightly feeling constrained at a time at which these infrastructure works are still carrying on, and of course, particularly with climate change, in many respects, we've got not only our many new infrastructure works coming in on stream anyway, but equally we have other threats as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this, we do hope, so I'm sort of going to move into winding up and closing down now, in case any one of my colleagues who are managing this are wondering where we are on the schedule. I think we intend, as I say, to publish the papers from this. So speakers today, other speakers who were in the meeting who spoke at previous seminars, and of course everyone else in previous seminars, we'll be sending round an email about that as soon as we can, giving a sort of format. It would be nice to have a sort of consistent set of papers with the basic situation outlined, some brilliant examples to show how exciting the subject is, some good discussions showing what the challenges are and how important the questions are, and then some discussion about ways forward. So we will start pulling that together as we move forward. In the meantime, I would just like to thank again Claudia, Zdravko, Pavel, Tibor, Edith, Miklos, Timur and Neil, Thomas and Neil, for their contributions today, to Gareth and Helen, who have been doing all the behind the scenes work, especially perhaps the Helen, who has been very much behind the scenes, but making sure all the technology works. And in an online seminar like this, without the technology, we are nothing, genuinely and completely, in terms of being able to make this work. So thank you very much, everybody, for your contribution today. I hope you've really enjoyed it. I sense that you have. It has felt a really exciting meeting, and every one of these seminars has been that. In covering 16 different states across Europe, we've covered a substantial, and more states as well, from panel discussants from other states that haven't been involved. We've covered a substantial amount of the continent, and it's thanks to your hard work and your willingness to be involved and to take part in this. So thank you very, very much for that. I very much look forward to the publication, and perhaps we could look forward, maybe once the publication is ready, to perhaps an in-person meeting, perhaps at an EAA conference where we can all get together and really enjoy the fact of what we've all been working on together, what we will have achieved and what we can look forward to having as a legacy of the work we've done as we move forward in medieval settlement studies and using that information from infrastructure development and making that infrastructure impact better in the future for medieval settlement studies. And thank you very much for that kind comment, Neil.
Thank you for organising. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And there is going to be a Ruralia also.
That would be, yes, it would be a brilliant Ruralia. Yes, that would be.
I all invite you to come to Norway in September. We talk about trade in rural sites.
Fantastic. We will keep in touch with you all. Thank you very much, and thank you for that invitation, Claudia. On that happy, optimistic note, I would say goodbye. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
And
Bye-bye.
be safely.